another episode of Thinking Historically About. Today we are thinking historically about the 1798 Sedition Act, and in particular, its compatibility with the First Amendment to the Constitution. To help us think historically about this topic, our guest today is Dr. Katlyn Carter, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Carter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'd love to get a sense of your own scholarly background before we dive into the particular question. And so if you could just kind of help us understand maybe your road to now, why study this era and area of history, what drew you and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I studied history as an undergraduate in college. I actually came to love it in high school, so before I even went to college. I studied it and I was always interested in politics. And when I graduated from college, I went to work in Washington, D.C. For a couple years. I worked in media relations on political issues. And while I was there, I just got really interested in how representative government works and the relationship between the government and the media and the role that the press plays in that process. And I knew I wanted to go back to school and study history. So I went and I got a PhD in history, and I decided I wanted to focus on the late 18th century, which was the founding of our modern democracy in the United States, but also in France, and experiments with it in lots of countries across the Atlantic world at that time. So I wanted to go to the founding moment and try to understand how a lot of our government structures that we still live with today were set up, and what people thought about them at the time. And as I started doing that, I really realized that there are a lot of parallels to our politics today, in especially the 1790s, which is when the Sedition Act is passed. A lot of polarization, a lot of debates about the truth or the concept of even fake news or kind of falsehoods and conspiracy theories and these kind of things. Fractured media landscape, all the kind of things that we're talking about today, they were there in different iterations already in the 1790s. So I just found it to be a really fascinating period to study, to try to better make sense of what's going on around us today.
One thing that stands out to me about your interest, most of the students that are listening to this are in a U.S. history class, right? But when you talked about kind of your areas of focus, you lumped Europe, or you specifically called out France in this era of history. And so maybe could you just help us understand like the connections there? Because oftentimes we compartmentalize by continent, especially in like high school history classes, and you clearly see connections that your specialty is maybe not geographically oriented, but intellectually oriented, or kind of what is that connection?
Yeah, that's a great question. We tend to study history by nation. And I think there's a good reason for that, right? Like part of the reason we study US history as Americans is to, better understand the past of our country, how we got where we are, and the political structures, the social dynamics, all of these things. And that's very important. But I found one way to actually do that is to think about the history of our country in comparison to, and also kind of in connection with, the history of other countries. And especially in the late 18th century, there's kind of a period that the American Revolution kicks off, which is kind of known as the Age of Revolution. And I mentioned specifically France. The French Revolution comes sort of right after the American Revolution. But there's also a lot of revolutions that happen in the Caribbean, like the Haitian Revolution, or in Latin America at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, that are all part of this kind of movement. And it's really interesting to study the American Revolution and early America in relation to these other revolutions, these other places, because they're dealing with a lot of the same concepts: the rise of thinking about human rights or self-government or the truth, and these kind of values. All of these places are grappling with those same set of ideas and challenges, and looking at how they played out in other revolutions and other countries can really help clarify what's unique about the American experience, but also what Americans have in common with other places that grappled with some of these same challenges at the same time.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think about it, and so often in the classroom, especially in like the world history classrooms, there's like a very common activity of comparing the Declaration of the Rights of Man to the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's because maybe because most of us teachers are US based, at least in my context, we want to bring the Declaration into the world history classroom. But I think it would be really, I hope maybe we would actually bring the French Revolution into the U.S. history classroom a little bit more, because there seems to be such a conversation going on that's worth you know engaging in to fully understand that moment.
Absolutely. And even something that I think is really helpful to think about is how, at the time, Americans were looking at what was happening in France, and
Mm,
they were comparing what they had dealt with and gone through to what they saw going on in France. And that was really influencing how they thought about the American Revolution and how
sure.
they made sense of the United States. And I think we tend to forget that. We tend to talk about how the early United States was kind of, insulated across an ocean from Europe, and was kind of doing its own thing. But in fact, Americans were looking across the Atlantic that whole time as they're trying to kind of make sense of their own revolution and develop a national identity over here too.
All right, let's dive into the Sedition Act.
Yeah,
So the students are looking in particular at the relationship of the Sedition Act to the First Amendment. And so I'm going to read the prompt that students are engaging with, and then I would love for you just to comment on how you would approach a prompt like that.
sounds good.
So the prompt asks students to evaluate the extent to which the Sedition Act of 1798 and the First Amendment of the United States Constitution were incompatible. So where do you go?
Well, the first thing I would do would be to read both of those documents, of
Uh-huh.
course. So go to the First Amendment, read that. Go to the Sedition Act, read that. Something that I often tell my students to do at the college level, and I do myself, that I think is really useful, is just identify some key terms. I would just
Yeah.
go to those and I would pick out some words that you see that might appear in both, or that you think,
Mm-hmm.
these are important, and then kind of use those and start from there. And something that I think that approach can help you immediately see is that in the First Amendment, things are not very clearly defined. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And that's true, with most of the Constitution. And that was, of course, by design. It's what makes it, applicable and have longevity, like continue to last today, because it leaves that room for interpretation, which is mostly carried out, of course, in the courts. So I think that's how I would kind of go about it, and then I would kind of start to look at some of the surrounding documents around both of these initial documents. So I might start looking at ratification debates about the First Amendment and see, what were people saying about it at the time? How did people talk about these issues or think about the free press at the time? And then I would kind of do the same thing for the Sedition Act. How were people talking about freedom of the press when they were debating this act, and whether or not it was constitutional? That might be where I would start. And of course, like all historians love to say, I don't think there's a really easy answer, which is what makes it a great question, because you can have a lot of different ways of interpreting the compatibility of these two things.
What I loved about how you started is it just showcased historical thinking. So, to start, you acknowledged that the First Amendment is not clear on how things are to be interpreted. And I think, just speaking of like those moments where I'm not thinking critically and I read freedom of the speech or freedom of the press, I instantly have a perception of what that means. And I assume that that is the perception, right? But then
Of
we
course.
we have to pause and think like, well, okay, I'm me, 2024, but what about the authors of this amendment in the 1780s and 1790s, where these conversations were being had? I can't just assume we have the same interpretation. And so I love that you said, like, let's go look at the ratification documents, and making something that I think in politics now people become dogmatic about and unopen to interpretation. But like the role of a scholar in engaging with this question on a scholarly level is to ask these questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Concepts change. I mean, from person to person, people have different notions that come to mind or perceptions of certain ideas. But I mean, it's certainly true if you go historically, something like free speech doesn't hold the exact same meaning across time. So, yeah, exactly what you said. It's really important to consider it. You can consider it from the modern perspective, of course, but then also to go back and consider it in its context at the time and think about how it had different meanings and also contested meanings. Like different people at the time had different ideas about what free speech meant.
So the Sedition Act was passed in a particular context. We have relations between Great Britain and France at the time. We have a new president, John Adams, the first president that's not George Washington. The ratification of the First Amendment. What I think it's 6 or 7 years before that. And so I'm wondering, like, in this context, is there a particular primary source that stands out to you that's worth investigating?
Yeah, so there are a lot of sources that you can go to, of course. You could look at some of the cases themselves that were tried under the Sedition Act. I think that's a great source to go to try to understand how it was actually getting implemented and how people were trying to protect themselves against the indictments that came down under it. But my favorite source to go to is actually a little bit later, and it's in 1801 when Congress debates whether they're going to renew the Sedition Act or let it expire. And something that's really interesting about that is that a lot of the Federalists, which is the party of John Adams, even though they lost the elections in 1800, they still were saying, no, we should keep this law, even though they would not be the ones in control of implementing it at that point. And that's something that I find really interesting. It seems kind of hard to explain given that, they certainly had some cynical reasons for passing the law, and it was, mostly used to go after printers of the opposition party. And yet you still had these politicians, knowing that they're not going to be the ones anymore implementing it, who are saying, no, there's still something worth keeping here and we should keep this law. And to me, that raises some interesting questions like, well, maybe they did have some genuine concerns about falsehood and the effect falsehood can have in the public sphere, and criticism of the government, even if they were not the ones in power. So I think those debates are really interesting to try to understand some of the deeper conversations that the Sedition Act brought forward that were about more than just politics and strategy, that were about deeper ideas, concerning the truth in a democracy and how it should work and function.
There's another unit that students engage with in our curriculum that looks at the ideas, compares the ideas between Jefferson and Hamilton. And so, like, one of the things that at least comes across in my reading of Jefferson is this almost inherent trust of the people, and then Hamilton's almost inherent distrust of the people, like a distrust of the tyranny of the masses and the uneducated aspects of the masses. And so I kind of wonder if that distrust plays out in those Federalist conversations in 1801, that, like, regardless of who's in power, we don't trust the masses to speak about them well. And we, as the authority figures, right, need to, maintain that separation. That's fascinating. And so often when I judge like modern legislation, I'm often thinking, like, does this side really want the other side to have this authority when they leave? And in the case of the Federalists in 1801, they said yes.
Not all of them did, but
Sure.
yeah, a lot of them did, which I think is surprising and does point to some of, like you said, some of their underlying convictions were not just about not trusting the other side or the people out of power at the time. It was actually this deeper kind of theory that they had about, like you said, this. I don't even know that I would put it as distrust of the
Hmm.
broader public, but sort of this idea that the broader public could easily be tricked,
Yeah.
or was, too. too ignorant or could be kind of taken advantage of by people lying to them. And that's kind of a prominent theme throughout their advocacy for the Sedition Act, is this idea that, the broader public doesn't have time or resources or maybe even the desire to investigate if what they're reading is true or false. And so we should have some rules about what they can take in. And we should make sure that it's true, by their judgment. So yeah, they place that ability with elected officials, with elites. And so yeah, I guess you could put that as they don't trust the public to do it for themselves, but it's also almost that they feel the public could easily be taken advantage of by bad actors, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I loved at the very beginning of the conversation, you talked about how getting into this era of history is really inspired by your kind of understanding of the political world now. And I think of, like, in education, we talk a lot about media literacy for students. And sometimes it's really hard to teach media literacy because I've dedicated my professional life to this type of work, and I also don't have the time to investigate every news article that I read. And so I tend to start to trust certain outlets or certain journalists, but that's not a foolproof approach to media. And so those, I don't know, you're like, I'm struggling because you're making a great case for the Sedition Act. I mean, at least from my hearing, like, just like, yeah, I mean, obviously maybe not to the same extent from my perspective, but
Yeah, I think that's what's important to just keep in mind, is that it's nuanced, because obviously I think Federalists identified some real problems, and I think, like you said, they're problems that we continue to face. Where it's true, as a consumer of news or information, you don't have often the resources or time or savvy to go and investigate everything that you take in. And so we develop these kind of shortcuts, right, of how we determine who to trust, what sources to trust, or quick ways we can kind of try to fact check what we're taking in. But it is, I think, a little bit, it's tough to put that entirely on the consumer of information. We also, it's not wrong to put some onus on the supply side of information. And the Federalists, I think, were right to point that out, and also to point out the potential danger of misinformation in a democratic government. But I think where they were wrong is, do we really want to put that power in the government? I don't think so. And I think a lot of the prosecutions under the Sedition Act prove that that's not a good place to put to put that kind of power. So I think it's important to look at, they might have identified some important problems or challenges, even if their solution was not the right solution, or is not what we would want as a solution.
okay, so let's talk perspective. I feel like we've hit a lot of these diverse perspectives around that era, about the Sedition Act, about the government's role. Um, but I'm curious, and you've looked through the unit that the students are engaging with. Is there a perspective out there that demands more attention that students should consider, or maybe just ask different questions about to better understand this prompt and this era?
One perspective, which goes back to what we were just talking about, that I think is important, is that often the Sedition Act is kind of seen as a dark spot in American history, and kind of a violation of free speech. I think it's often seen today as a violation of the First Amendment, or something that we would say is not compatible with it. In a lot of ways, I think that's right. It's important that we see the dangers of it, and the things that were negative about the outcome of the Sedition Act. But I also think it is important, and it's often forgotten, that there are some, like we were saying, there are also some motivations behind it that are worth taking seriously, and seeing that there were some merit in these concerns, and that also the case that was made against the Sedition Act, Democratic Republicans argued very strongly that it was a violation of the First Amendment. And one of the things that they argued is that you just can't adjudicate fact in the political sphere. Like, it's just it's impossible. And they pointed to something important, which is that, it is impossible to adjudicate opinions as true or false. And they were right about that. But in making that case so strongly, I think that there's kind of a legacy they've left of us in the United States just saying in the political realm, essentially everything is opinion. That that it's not possible to adjudicate. So we should just have this real laissez-faire attitude, which in the U.S. we have much more strongly than in a lot of other countries that also have guarantees of free speech or free press. And I think that that's a more nuanced legacy, to think about the implications of that, of kind of essentially throwing up our hands and saying, well, like you said, it's kind of all on the consumer of information. Like there's no way we can referee true and false in the political sphere, and I think that there's some unintended dangers to that also.
You mentioned the perspective very slightly, but this global perspective that there are many other countries that have these guarantees, these rights that are embedded into their systems of government, and yet are, I don't know, sometimes it's almost like a Wild West mentality when it comes to free speech. It's like, any parameter or any guideline or any referee is seen as an infringement, but maybe that's too far.
Right.
And maybe it's not, but at least looking at that global perspective and looking at these charters or constitutions of other countries and the legislative trail, it might illuminate some more questions, and that can always be helpful.
Absolutely, yeah.
So when you're engaging in this era, this topic with your students, what do you want them to get out of it? What are your hopes?
My hopes are really just to think exactly about these points that a lot of times there's not a simple answer to a lot of the challenges that we're facing. I also think that looking at things historically and taking ourselves back to these historical contexts and investigating, opinions about these things at different times, I think that can really help break us out of the polarized moment that we're in right now and help kind of get us beyond a lot of our assumptions and start to see things outside of the political dynamic that we're in right now. And I think that we really need that right now in the US. We need, and I think history is a really helpful way to do that, to find ways to break out of these rigid distinctions and kind of battles that the country seems to be stuck in right now. History, I think, can really help us get out of that and think about things from new perspectives and open up new dialogues across these, hardened differences.
Yeah, I remember reading The Historian's Craft by Mark Bloch, and he had this like section where he distinguished between the scholar and the judge, and like the role of a judge is to pronounce a verdict. Like that's the job, but that's not the job of a scholar. The job of a scholar is to unearth, to understand. And I think in the realm of a historian, it's to understand oftentimes people from a time and place not like ours. But that, we call it in our resources, we call it historical empathy. And that's like job to understand first, to acknowledge that we live in a different context, and then ask questions. And that I think also kind of breeds some humility, right? That let's seek out answers rather than come into a situation having already known the answers.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think history is a uniquely powerful discipline to practice those skills and to empower people to do that.
We do too. Well, Dr. Katlyn Carter, thank you so much for this conversation, for helping us think historically about the Sedition Act, the nature of the act, and its relationship to the Constitution.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.